All right, it's Friday. I'm going to wrap the week up with a story or a parable, a metaphor, something that ties together the different videos from the week, right? So we started talking about the idea of consciousness precipitating through the universe as the universe cools, and what we recognize as the laws of science, the laws of karma, cause and effect, right? The laws of gravity, just so the underlying structures of the universe as they cool, allowing for the creation of ever more complicated relationships, including then sort of the cellular metabolic aggregation that is, this body, and then the associated thoughts, culture, and society that comes from that. And then the second idea that outside of time, or alongside of time, or where time is shifted from the y-axis against which things occur to the x-axis, where we measure the quality of time, that there's this object in hyperspace that has a sort of a teleological pull for us, but also is casting a pattern that across time, when we step outside of linear time, presents some kind of coherence. And the idea was that these are ideas that I've taken from Terence McKenna, and they're ideas that are deeply embedded in how I see myself and how I see the universe, and that scrutinizing these is a useful exercise. And so I'm not presenting them as like a carved set of truths. What I'm suggesting is that on examination, you also have, even if you don't think that you do, you have equally held ideas about what it is to exist, and that understanding those and articulate them is a fun and useful exercise. But like I said, I thought I would wrap up with a story, right? And I want us to think of the ocean, and the shoreline of an ocean that has many, many rock pools, right? So as the tide comes in and covers the shoreline with water, the rock pools are filled with fresh abundance. They're filled with maybe new creatures come in, new material, new sediment, rocks, seaweed, floating flotsam and jetsam that hover above the pool, because maybe the pool is now under several feet of water. No longer a distinct entity or location, but part of the tide, part of the ocean. Right? So then as the ocean recedes, of course, what happens then is the water level subsides, which in this parable is equivalent to the cooling of the universe, right? The ebb of the tide is the cooling of the universe, the creation of those covalent bonds. And so then what happens at a certain point is that the edge of the rock pool breaks the surface of the receding time. And now you have a pool. Now, we need to think of the scale of time, because we know tides come in and out twice a day. And to us, that seems quite frequent. Right? But let's imagine that we are creatures who dwell within the rock pool, and the scale of time is different. We don't think of this as being a daily occurrence, because perhaps our lifespan is quite short. Maybe there are creatures in the rock pool who don't even live, whose lifespan, while it may be full and complete, and filled with joy and wisdom, that lifespan may not even persist through one tide. Right? So imagine that the tide, in our context, the tide is 100 years. So some of us, as humans, may have lived through a tide, but most of us haven't. We've heard about them, but we haven't experienced a tide. We live within the rock pool, and we examine the nature of the rock, the sides of the rock, the bottom of the pool. We're aware of the circulation of water within the rock pool, and we may have some myth or even some experimental recognition that the fluctuation of the water is caused by these larger events that we haven't directly experienced, but we have evidence of them. We can see that there are objects in the pool that have different characteristics that suggest that they arrived in different waves. There's a pattern to them that we can anticipate, that we can meditate upon. Perhaps one or two of us are able to climb the side of the rock pool. And perhaps when we do that, most of our friends and family look and think, why are you doing that? It's a waste of time. It's foolish. It's incomprehensible. And then as you get higher and higher, maybe people try to pull you back down because they're worried about you. They're scared for what's going to happen. Or they're angry that you're challenging the idea that life exists at the bottom of the rock pool. Right? At the bottom of the rock pool, there are clear laws about how things work, right? The same way that we live on the planet, the surface of the planet, things like gravity and time appear absolutely immutable. But we know that elsewhere in the universe, as we move away from gravitational sinkholes, things like time change. The passing of time in our clocks, in like super accurate atomic clocks on the space station, are not telling the same time because time passes differently according to the concentration of gravity. Time passes differently according to the speed that we're traveling. Not just the perception of time, but the actual quality of time, which is why when we take time from the x-axis and shift it to the y-axis, there's another unit, the hyper unit, I don't have a better name for it, that becomes the x-axis. Those things become apparent as our rock pool cousins reach the top and can look out and see the ocean. They can see other rock pools. They can see the sky. They can witness the view down into the rock pool, right? All kinds of experiences, understanding become apparent. They can also see the tide coming in, and they can tell people back in the rock pool, look what's going to happen. Look what has already happened. The perception of duration, of mortality, all shift once you've climbed to the top of the rock pool. Now, in our scientific paradigm, we have made assumptions that the rock pool is the entirety, or if there is another rock pool, it will be similar to ours. We make those assumptions when we talk about what we're looking for when we scrutinize the universe for extraterrestrial intelligence. We assume that that intelligence must live in a rock pool. But a bird doesn't live in a rock pool. So when we jump off the edge of the rock pool and we gradually sink back down to our friends at the bottom of the rock pool and our daily lives down there, we are now just as the prisoner who escaped from Plato's cave, who first recognized that in Plato's cave you are watching shadows that are caused by light behind you, and then left the cave and saw the sun. How do you describe the sun to the inhabitants of Plato's cave? Right? How do you describe the ocean to the inhabitants of a rock pool? I find this a very helpful story. And I don't mean to be negative to the inhabitants of the rock pool. What I'm trying to show here primarily is that the shoreline is dotted with innumerable rock pools, and that there is consciousness and life and meaning in many, many different locations, and that it all came from the same ebbing tide of the universe, of the ocean, just as we live in a concentration. So we live in a planetary concentration. We live in a metabolic concentration. And then beneath the metabolism, we live in sort of concretized, reified moments. But every one of those is a rock pool, and there's a level, there's an ocean beyond it. The idea that we developed independently from the bottom of the rock pool up, right, which is maybe the idea that I'm trying to disassociate us from here, that I'm trying to decouple us from, that there is a process unique to our rock pool that created who and what we are, and that instead we are the result of the ongoing ebb and flow of a tide, which is the cooling of the universe. And yeah, I guess if I take that metaphor to its extent, that the universe is a tide, and we are in an ebbing of the universe, and there will be a flowing of the universe where we are refreshed and some unimaginable point of view that perhaps is the singularity, where everything changes and yet nothing changes, right? We're in the rock pool surrounded by the ocean. Now the ocean is flowing back in, but it's not like it's not nothing. We're not destroying everything. We're just changing everything. So maybe the parable fails there, but I don't think it does. I think it actually takes us to the edge, and like with all good parables, leaves us with questions to ponder, a direction to consider. Anyway, I'm going to wrap today and the week teeming with life, teeming with meaning. Let me know if you have any questions or comments or different points of view, corrections, anything. Just drop a note. And then on Thursdays, I pull all of those together and can kind of dig in and go through specific question and answers. Keep your wits about you.